The silence is the most dangerous part. It has descended upon the Palatine Hill like a shroud, heavier and more suffocating than the smoke from the censers that burn day and night. The scent of cinnamon, myrrh, unspeakable hangs in the corridors of the Golden House, a cloying attempt to mask the smell of decay, not of a body, but of an emperor's mind. You are a courtier in the palace of Nero, and for weeks you have learned to walk without sound, to speak in whispers, and to make yourself as small as possible. Every shadow seems to hold a spy, every closed door a conspiracy. The Empress Poppaea Sabina is dead, and in the vacuum of her absence, a quiet madness has begun to bloom. You see it in the emperor's eyes when he passes, a vacant, searching look that does not seem to register the living. He is a man haunted by a ghost of his own making, and you know, with a cold certainty that settles deep in your bones, that he will soon demand that the world share in his delusion. This is your reality in the wake of the empress's death. The man at the center of this suffocating stillness is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. So before we bear witness to what truly happened, take a moment to like and subscribe to stand with us. But only if you feel compelled to remember the stories that the world has tried to forget. In the comments below, share your thoughts on the historical figure you believe is most misunderstood or misrepresented. The stage is now set. The actors have taken their places. Let the house lights fall and let the tragedy unfold. In the year 65 AD, the Roman Empire lost its empress. Poppaea Sabina, pregnant with her second child by Nero, died. The official accounts, disseminated for public consumption, were carefully managed. They spoke of a sudden illness, a tragic complication of her pregnancy that stole away the beautiful and beloved wife of the emperor. It was a narrative of fate, of the cruel and indifferent gods. But within the marble halls of the imperial court, and later in the writings of historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, a different, more disturbing account took root. This version filtered through the pens of senatorial elites, who viewed Nero with a mixture of contempt and fear, did not blame the gods. It blamed the emperor. According to these sources, Poppaea's death was the result of a domestic incident, a moment of startling, impulsive violence. Following his return to the palace late one evening, supposedly after indulging his passion for the chariot races, Nero was met with his wife's reproaches. In a fit of rage, he is said to have kicked her. Whether the act was intended to cause fatal harm is a matter of speculation. Given her pregnant condition, however, the consequences were absolute. The official narrative was a necessary fiction. The private truth whispered in secret was one of patricide, matricide, and now oxoricide. Nero's reaction to her death was anything but restrained. It was a spectacle of grief so extravagant that it bordered on the pathological. Roman tradition for the elite dictated cremation, a final purification by fire. Nero rejected this custom. Instead, Poppaea's body was embalmed, filled with expensive spices and perfumes in the manner of the Egyptian pharaohs, a practice alien and unsettling to the Roman aristocracy. Her body was then laid to rest in the mausoleum of Augustus, an honor reserved for the most revered members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The funeral itself was an exercise in imperial excess. From the rostra in the Roman Forum, Nero himself delivered the eulogy. He wept openly, praising her divine beauty and lamenting the loss of their unborn child. According to the historian Pliny the Elder, the quantity of incense burned on her funeral pyre exceeded the entire annual production of Arabia. It was a display designed to perfume an entire city with the scent of his sorrow, to ensure that no citizen could ignore the depth of the emperor's loss. Soon after, he successfully lobbied a reluctant senate to grant her divine honors. She was deified, becoming Diva Poppaea. A temple was constructed to house her cult, and priests were appointed to oversee her worship. This performance of mourning was not simply the act of a grieving husband. It was a political and psychological necessity for Nero. The deification served to elevate Poppaea beyond the reach of rumor and place her death in the realm of celestial tragedy, absolving the emperor of any earthly culpability. More profoundly, however, it revealed a psyche incapable of processing loss in a conventional manner. For Nero, a man whose entire existence was a performance, grief itself had to be his greatest production. The emptiness in the imperial bed was not just a personal void, It was a flaw in the fabric of his world, a disruption to the narrative of his own life that he found intolerable. He had not simply lost a wife, he had lost his most prized audience and his most perfect reflection. The silence in her chambers echoed the growing silence in his own soul, a vacuum that his unstable and theatrical nature could not endure. This profound psychological wound, this obsessive fixation on what was lost, would not be allowed to heal. Instead, it would fester, and soon it would drive the emperor to seek a replacement not in the conventional sense, but through an act of unprecedented and horrific recreation. The empty bed had to be filled, no matter the cost. The grand ceremonies concluded, and the ashes of the Arabian incense settled into the streets of Rome. The divine Poppaea had her temple, and the Roman people had their spectacle. But for Nero, the performance was far from over. It had merely moved from a public stage to the private, labyrinthine corridors of his own mind. The pathology of his grief did not recede with time. Instead, it intensified, condensing from an explosive, public display into a dense, silent obsession. Writing more than a century later but drawing on earlier sources, chronicles this period with a clinical eye. He notes that the emperor's melancholy was unceasing. Nero would speak of his departed wife constantly, not merely with the fondness of a widower, but with the repetitive fixation of a mind caught in a loop. He would praise her beauty to courtiers who had already heard the same eulogies 100 times. He would lament his loss, not in quiet reflection but in prolonged, theatrical monologues that demanded the feigned sympathy of all present. For the Roman elite, an emperors were a matter of statecraft. A suitable bride from a noble family would forge new alliances, secure political loyalties, and most importantly provide an heir to ensure the stability of the dynasty. After a respectable period of mourning, the expectation was that Nero would seek a new wife. Suitors and their families would have positioned themselves, preparing their daughters for the possibility of becoming the next empress. Nero, however, rejected this political and social script entirely. His refusal was not passive. It was violent and absolute. He briefly considered marrying his own stepsister, Claudia Antonia, the daughter of the former Emperor Claudius. Such a union would have been politically advantageous, further consolidating his connection to the deified Claudius. But Antonia refused his proposal. In a court where the emperor's will was law, this refusal was an unforgivable act of defiance. Nero accused her of plotting a rebellion and had her executed. This act was profoundly revealing. It demonstrated that Nero was not seeking a replacement empress. He was seeking the impossible, the restoration of Poppaea herself. Any other woman was a pale imitation, an insult to the perfect image he held in his memory. The execution of Antonia was a clear and brutal message to the aristocracy. There would be no successor. The role of empress was not vacant, it was haunted. His grief had twisted into a perverse form of fidelity, a loyalty to a memory so powerful that it actively destroyed any attempt to move beyond it. He inhabited a world where Poppaea was not truly gone, merely absent. He saw his reality not as a historian would, as a sequence of events, but as a playwright does, as a scene that could be revised and restaged until it met his satisfaction. Poppaea's death was a flaw in the narrative, and he, the ultimate artist-temperer, was determined to correct it. This obsession was not with Poppaea the person, her intellect, her ambition, her political counsel, but with Poppaea the object. It was a fixation on her physical form. The historical sources are clear on this point. What Nero endlessly mourned was her face, the specific curve of her features, the tone of her voice, the way she appeared in the gowns and jewels he had lavished upon her. He had lost his most beautiful possession, and his grief was a form of aesthetic agony. He was not trying to recapture a lost emotional connection. He was trying to reconstruct a visual masterpiece. His mind, steeped in Greek art and the pursuit of perfect forms, began to seek not a new love, but a new medium. If the original was lost, a perfect replica would have to be found. The transition from this internal, psychological state to external action was inevitable for a man with absolute power. An ordinary man's obsession remains a private torment. An emperor's obsession becomes state policy. The vast resources of the Roman Empire, Its network of spies, officials, and informants, which were typically used to uncover plots, collect taxes, and manage provinces, were slowly reoriented toward a new, bizarre purpose. The emperor's gaze began to scan the world not for threats or opportunities, but for a reflection of what he had lost. The private lamentations within the Golden House began to crystallize into a specific, imperial directive. The search was not for a woman. His fixation was too specific, too tied to an exact memory. He needed a blank canvas, a form that could be molded and shaped to fit the precise contours of his obsession. And so the quiet, desperate search began, not in the noble houses of Rome, but in the streets, the slave markets, and the administrative roles of the city. The emperor was no longer just mourning his wife, he was hunting for her ghost. The imperial directive, once articulated, spread through the official and unofficial channels of the Roman court with quiet urgency. It was a task unlike any other. This was not a search for a new general, a skilled artist, or a provincial governor. The criteria were singular and deeply unsettling. The emperor required an individual who possessed the precise facial features of the deceased and deified Poppaea Sabina. This was not a quest for a general resemblance, a type of beauty that might evoke the late empress. It was a search for a physical duplicate, a living echo. Imperial agents, freedmen loyal to Nero, and courtiers eager to curry favor, began the process of scouring the vast human landscape of Rome. They looked everywhere, examining faces in the markets, in the public baths, and in the sprawling slave depots where human beings were catalogued like livestock. The search itself created a subtle but pervasive sense of unease. For a Roman citizen, being noticed by the emperor's men was usually a sign of either great fortune or imminent danger. But this strange new scrutiny was different. It was intimate and objectifying. People were evaluated not for their skills, their family connections, or their political allegiances, but for the accidental arrangement of their bones and flesh. The uncanny resemblance was the sole qualification, particularly those of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, specify that the search focused on finding a youth who could stand in for the lost empress. This detail is crucial. Nero was not looking for another woman who might resemble Poppaea, as such a person would come with her own identity, her own history, and her own will, making her an imperfect vessel for his fantasy. A young boy, particularly one of low social standing, was a far more malleable medium. He would be a blank slate upon which the emperor could project his creation. The choice to seek a male subject was also a reflection of the established norms of Roman sexuality, particularly among the elite. Pederastic relationships, while not universally approved, were a common and accepted feature of the social landscape. A relationship between an older man of high status and a younger male of lower status did not carry the same inherent challenges to the social order as a public, quasi-marital arrangement with another woman. However, Nero's intent was not simply to find a new companion. The purpose was far more specific and psychologically complex. He sought to literally resurrect Poppaea in a new form. The breakthrough in this bizarre quest came when a young man was identified. The sources are sparse on the exact details of his discovery. It is unknown whether he was found in the city of Rome or during one of the emperor's tours of Italy. What is consistently reported is that a youth was found whose face bore a startling, almost supernatural resemblance to the deceased empress. This was the moment the emperor's abstract obsession found a tangible focus. The resemblance was so striking that courtiers, ever eager to validate their master's perceptions, are said to have commented on it with feigned astonishment. For them, it was a way to demonstrate loyalty. For Nero, it was proof that the world could, in fact, be bent to his will. He had willed a ghost back into the physical realm. This discovery was not the culmination of his grief, but the beginning of its most monstrous expression. The youth was brought before Nero, and the emperor's approval sealed his fate. In that moment, the boy ceased to be an individual and became a solution to an imperial problem. He was a piece of living clay, identified and acquired for a singular, horrific purpose. Nero saw in his face not a person with a past and a potential future, but a vessel for a ghost. The resemblance was both a miracle and a curse. It was the key that unlocked the darkest chambers of Nero's imagination and set in motion a plan, that would move beyond mere companionship into the realm of physical and psychological reconstruction. The search had been for a face, but the project would require the complete erasure of the person behind it. The uncanny resemblance was the first step in a process of transformation that would violate every Roman norm of law, religion, and identity. The raw material for the emperor's grotesque masterpiece had been located. The youth who possessed this fateful resemblance is identified in the historical records by a single name, Sporus. The name itself is of Greek origin, deriving from the word which translates to seed, sowing, or offspring. It is a detail of such profound and tragic irony that a dramatist would be accused of contrivance. For the historian, it must be recorded simply as a fact. The name suggests a background rooted in the Eastern, Greek-speaking half of the empire, where such names were common, especially among the enslaved and newly freed populations. His exact age is not recorded, but the term used to describe him denoted a boy in his early to mid-teens. His social status is a subject of some minor historical debate, though the practical implications remain the same. Some sources imply he was a young slave selected for his beauty and groomed to serve as a personal attendant and companion to a wealthy master. Others, including Cassius Dio, suggest he was already a freedman. If he was a slave, he was a slave. He was chattel property with no legal rights, entirely subject to the whims of his owner. If he was a freedman, his position was only marginally better. A freed slave in Rome existed in a state of quasi-freedom. He owed a lifetime of deference and specific duties to his former master, who was now his patron. He was legally a person, but socially, he was forever marked by his servile origins and remained entangled in a web of obligations. In either scenario, Sporus was utterly powerless. His life before this moment can only be reconstructed through inference. It was likely a life of anonymity of a wealthy Roman household. His days would have been structured around the needs of a patron, his world confined to the duties assigned to him. His education, if any, would have been practical, aimed at making him a more useful and pleasing servant. He would have learned to be observant, obedient, and invisible, to anticipate needs without being asked, to speak only when spoken to, and to navigate the complex hierarchies of the domestic staff. His personal ambitions, if he was allowed to have any, would have been modest, to earn the favor of his master, perhaps to gain his freedom if he were a slave, or to secure a small degree of financial independence if he were already free. It was a precarious existence, but a predictable one. The greatest danger he likely imagined was the displeasure of his patron, a demotion or a sale to a crueler master. The arrival of the imperial agents would have shattered this fragile reality. Whether they found him in the household of another aristocrat or plucked him from a more obscure corner of the city, the summons would have been absolute. There would be no negotiation, no refusal. He would have been brought from his familiar world of structured servitude into the blinding, unpredictable heart of imperial power, the Domus Aurea, Nero's sprawling golden house. There, he would have been presented to the emperor. We must pause to consider this encounter from Sporus' perspective. He would have been standing before a man who was not just an emperor but a living god in the eyes of many, a figure of absolute and often lethal caprice. The imperial gaze, which could grant life, bestow fortunes, or condemn to death with a passing word, was now fixed upon him. But Nero was not seeing him. He was seeing a ghost. He was examining the boy's features not as one appraises a person, but as a connoisseur appraises an object. A statue, a vase, a work of art that might serve a specific purpose. For Sporus, this intense, analytical scrutiny must have been terrifying. He was being judged against a template he did not know, for a role he could not comprehend. When Nero gave his approval, when he confirmed that the resemblance was satisfactory, Sporus's identity was effectively erased. His past life, his name, his sense of self, all became irrelevant. He was no longer Sporus, the freed boy or the slave. He was now a project. He was the raw material for an imperial resurrection. The transaction was complete. An individual had been acquired by the state, not for labor, not for military service, but for a purpose born from the emperor's disordered grief. From this moment forward, his body was not his own. It was a canvas, and the emperor, the self-proclaimed supreme artist, was preparing his instruments. Sporus had ceased to be a subject in his own life story. He had become an object in Nero's. With the subject acquired, the second phase of the emperor's project began. The resemblance was a matter of facial structure, but the illusion of Poppaea required a far more fundamental alteration. The living boy, Sporus, was undeniably male. His body was developing along a biological trajectory that would soon diverge completely from the feminine ideal Nero sought to resurrect. The deepening of his voice, the growth of facial hair, the very essence of his maturing masculinity. These were flaws in the medium, imperfections that had to be corrected before the true work of transformation could begin. For Nero, the solution was not a matter of debate or moral contemplation. It was a practical, albeit extreme, necessity. The obstacle was biological, and so the solution had to be surgical. The imperial command was issued. It was likely not a public edict or a formal decree, but a quiet, chilling instruction delivered within the private chambers of the Domus Aurea. The recipients would have been the emperor's most trusted freedmen and the court physicians. These were men whose lives and fortunes were entirely dependent on the emperor's favor. To question an imperial wish was professional suicide. To refuse a direct command was a death sentence. The order was for the castration of Sporus. This was the irrevocable decision, the physical act that would serve as the foundation for the entire grotesque fantasy. To understand the gravity of this command, one must place it in its legal context. Under Roman law, specifically the Canelian law on assassins and poisoners, the act of castration was a serious crime, legally equivalent to assassination or poisoning. The law, established a century earlier, was designed to protect the integrity of the Roman body and prohibit the creation of eunuchs within the borders of Italy. While the practice existed in the eastern provinces and eunuchs were imported as slaves, performing the act on Roman soil, particularly on a free man or a freedman, was a capital offense. For any other citizen, issuing such an order would have resulted in exile or execution. But Nero was not any other citizen, and in his reign, the distinction between the emperor's will and the state's law had become fatally blurred. His command did not just condemn Sporus to mutilation. It was an act of profound political arrogance, a demonstration that the emperor himself stood outside and above the very laws he was sworn to uphold. For such a transgressive act, a justification, however thin, was required. Nero's court, filled with sycophants and terrified functionaries, would have readily supplied one. The official rationale, whispered among the inner circle, would have been framed in pseudo-medical anesthetic terms. The court physicians, trained in the Hellenistic medical traditions, would have understood the physiological effects of prepubertal castration. That the procedure was necessary to preserve the boy's delicate, youthful features. It would halt the physical changes of manhood, ensuring his face remained soft and beardless, his voice high-pitched. The operation was thus framed not as an act of mutilation, but as an act of mutilation, a way to permanently fix Sporus's uncanny resemblance to Poppaea and prevent nature from corrupting the perfect likeness. This justification transformed a brutal act of personal obsession into a calculated, almost artistic procedure. It sanitized the violence, recasting it as a necessary step in the creation of a masterpiece. For Sporus, these abstract justifications were meaningless. The reality of his situation would have become clear in the most terrifying way imaginable. He was a prisoner of an imperial whim. He would not have been consulted, his consent was not a factor. He likely learned of his fate not through explanation, but through the arrival of the men tasked with carrying out the order. He would have seen the physicians, the surgical assistants, the strong armed slaves tasked with holding him down. In that moment of cold, terrifying realization, the full scope of his powerlessness would have been made absolute. He was not just a servant or a possession, he was a body to be unilaterally, irrevocably altered to suit his master's desires. The legal framework irrelevant, and the pseudo-medical justification was merely the formal paperwork for an atrocity. The emperor had decreed that Sporus the boy must be unmade, so that Poppaea the woman could be created. The procedure was not conducted in a sterile military hospital, but within a secluded chamber of the Domus Aurea. The setting was one of domestic opulence. a backdrop of frescoes and gilded stucco that stood in stark contrast to the clinical brutality of the act. The physicians tasked with the operation were not acting as healers but as instruments of the emperor's will. Their expertise was repurposed from mending the body to deconstructing it. Roman surgical knowledge, while sophisticated for its era, was entirely unequipped to manage the two primary consequences of such an invasive procedure: overwhelming physiological shock and subsequent infection. Anesthetics were rudimentary at best, consisting of potent wine or extracts from plants like mandrake or henbane, substances that could induce a state of stupor, but did little to block the transmission of extreme sensory trauma to the brain. The primary tool for managing the patient was not sedation, but overwhelming physical restraint. Sporus was an unwilling participant in his own dismantling. The operation itself, the surgical removal of the testes, involved the surgical removal of the testes. The practitioners would have used a sharpened scalpel to make the necessary incisions. The primary and most immediate challenge was managing the inevitable hemorrhage. Cauterization with heated irons was one common method, searing the blood vessels shut in a crude but effective manner. Ligatures of linen thread might be used to tie off the spermatic cords. Each step of the process was fraught with peril. A slip of the blade, excessive bleeding, or the shock to the nervous system could easily prove fatal on the operating table. Survival of the initial procedure was merely the first hurdle. The days and weeks that followed were a precarious battle against the unseen enemy of sepsis. In an era without any understanding of germ theory, the concept of surgical sterility was non-existent. Instruments were wiped clean but not sterilized. The hands of the physicians were not washed in an antiseptic manner. The surgical site was vulnerable to any number of environmental pathogens, and the suppuration of the incision were considered normal parts of the recovery process, but they could quickly spiral into a systemic infection for which there was no cure. Sporus' survival was, therefore, a matter of chance as much as constitution. He had to endure not only the trauma of the mutilation but also the subsequent siege upon his immune system. The physical consequences of the act, should the patient survive, were permanent and profound. The removal of the primary source of testosterone production would halt the progression of male puberty. His voice would not deepen, his facial hair would not grow, and his musculature would not develop along a typically male pattern. The body would be locked in a state of hormonal ambiguity, a physical limbo that was precisely the outcome Nero desired. This was the preservation that the court's pseudo-medical rationale had promised, a body chemically and physically arrested in a state of prepubescence, making it a more suitable template for feminization. Beyond the quantifiable physiological changes, however, was a deeper, psychological violation. The surgery was an act of profound and irreversible disempowerment. It was an assault on Sporus's fundamental identity as a male in a patriarchal society where a man's worth, honor, and future were intrinsically linked to his virility to produce heirs. In a single brutal act, he was stripped of that potential future. He could never be a husband in the Roman sense, never a head of a household. He was relegated to a new, liminal category of being, neither fully male nor truly female, a created object defined by his master's fantasy. The recovery from the physical trauma would have been a slow, agonizing process. But the recovery from the psychological trauma was impossible because recovery was not the goal. The goal was erasure. The pain, the fever, the disorientation of his convalescence were all part of the process of unmaking Sporus the boy. He was being broken down to his constituent parts so that he could be reassembled into something else. As his body slowly and painfully healed from the incision, he was forced to confront a new reality reflected not in a mirror, but in the eyes of his keepers. He was no longer a person in their view, but a successful outcome, a project that had survived its most dangerous phase. The physical mutilation was complete. The blank canvas was now prepared, stretched, and ready for the emperor's mad artistry to begin in earnest. With Sporus' body physically and hormonally reshaped to the emperor's specifications, the next phase of the project commenced. It was to be a public unveiling, but one carefully staged on foreign soil, away from the deeply conservative and judgmental gaze of the Roman senatorial elite. In the year 66 AD, Nero embarked on an extended tour of Greece. This was not a military campaign or an administrative inspection. It was a grand artistic pilgrimage. The emperor of the Roman world became a contestant, participating in the great Pan-Hellenic Games, the Olympic, the Pythian, the Isthmian, and the Nemean. He competed as a singer, a lyre player, and a charioteer, collecting an unprecedented 1808 victory wreaths. The competitions were, of course, a sham. No judge dared to declare another competitor superior to the master of 30 legions. This tour was the ultimate expression of Nero's artistic narcissism, a period when he inhabited his preferred role as a supreme performer on the world's most venerable stage. It was in this atmosphere of theatricality and detachment from Roman reality that Nero chose to formalize his relationship with Sporus. He decided they would be married. The ceremony was not a private affair but a public ritual performed with all the traditional trappings of a Roman wedding. It took place in one of the cities of Greece, though the precise location is lost to history. This choice of venue was critical. Greece, in the Roman imagination, was a land of greater license, a place where traditions were more fluid and the populace more accustomed to the eccentricities of powerful rulers. Staging the wedding here was a test, a way to normalize the arrangement within the controlled environment of his traveling court before presenting it to the more volatile capital. The preparations for the ceremony were meticulous. Sporus was no longer referred to by his own name. He was now to be called Sabina, the name of the dead empress. This was the first and most crucial step in the public act of erosua. He was then dressed as a Roman bride. This involved the wearing of the traditional straight tunic, a straight, sleeveless tunic woven in a single piece, fastened at the waist with a woolen girdle tied in the knot of Hercules, a symbol of chastity that only the husband was meant to untie. Over this he would have worn the flame-colored veil, the iconic veil that covered the upper part of the bride's face. His hair would have been styled in the elaborate fashion of a Roman matron, an elaborate style of 6 braided locks, a complex arrangement of 6 braided locks, a style traditionally associated with the Vestal Virgins. Finally, he was adorned with the jewelry and finery befitting an emperor. The ceremony itself adhered strictly to Roman custom. Aid Ari was formally provided by the emperor, a legalistic absurdity in which Nero effectively paid himself to marry the boy he owned. There was a matron of honor who had been married only once, to join the couple's right hands in the symbolic joining of right hands. The vows were exchanged. Sacrifices were likely made to the appropriate gods, invoking Juno, the goddess of marriage, in a ritual of profound blasphemy. The entire affair was witnessed by Nero's extensive entourage, his friends, his Praetorian Guard officers. These men were not merely spectators, they were participants. Their presence lent the event an air of legitimacy. Their silence, their applause, their formal congratulations, all were acts of complicity in the emperor's grand delusion. For Sporus, this experience would have been one of profound psychological dissonance, public humiliation. Encased in the restrictive and unfamiliar garments of a woman, his face obscured by a veil, he was paraded before the very people who knew his true identity. He was a silent puppet in a state-sponsored pageant of his own unmaking. Every ritual gesture, every traditional formula spoken, reinforced his new, fabricated identity while simultaneously mocking the sacred traditions they were meant to honor. This was not a union, it was an installation, the formal presentation of a living art piece. By using the solemn and legally binding framework of Roman marriage, Nero was attempting to impose his private fantasy onto public reality. He was daring the world to see what he saw, to accept Sporus not as a mutilated boy, but as the resurrected Empress Sabina. The Greek wedding was the first official act of this new reality. The performance had been a success in the sheltered world of the imperial tour. The next step would be to take the production to its ultimate and most challenging venue, the city of Rome itself. Upon Nero's return to Italy in 68 AD, the production that had been tested on the Greek stage was prepared for its Roman premiere. The first wedding had been a private ceremony for the imperial court. The second was to be a public spectacle for the capital itself. It was a calculated act of defiance, a direct challenge to the customs, laws and moral sensibilities of the Roman elite. Nero was no longer content to see in the relative privacy of his entourage. He now demanded that the Roman state itself bear witness and, through its participation, validate his delusion. The union had to be solemnized not just in a distant province, but in the heart of the empire, under the gaze of the gods and the people of Rome. This Roman ceremony was orchestrated with an even greater attention to public form and legalistic detail. A prominent courtier, a man of consular rank, was selected to play the role of the bride's father. He formally gave away Sporus in the traditional manner. This was a critical piece of theatre, a legal fiction designed to place the union within the familiar framework of a legitimate patriarchal transaction. The most significant role in this charade, however, was played by Avonius Gellinus. The powerful and universally feared Praetorian prefect, Gellinus, Nero's co-conspirator and enforcer, hosted the wedding feast. It was a lavish public banquet, a statement of state-sanctioned approval from the very highest echelons of military and political power. His involvement sent an unambiguous message to the Senate and the people. This was not an emperor's private eccentricity to be mocked. It was an official reality to be accepted, and the Praetorian Guard stood ready to enforce its acceptance. Sporus, once again dressed in the flame-colored veil and the robes of a bride, was paraded through the streets of Rome in a public procession. He was accompanied by the traditional chorus of well-wishers, his retinue shouting the ritual wedding acclamation Tia Lucio. The Roman populace, a notoriously volatile and cynical audience, lined the streets. Their reaction, as recorded by the historian Cassius Dio, was a mixture of horror, morbid curiosity, and dark humor. Dio reports a grim joke that circulated through the city that the world would have been a better place if Nero's own father, Gnaeus Domitius Aecinobarbus, had taken such a wife. It was a sentiment that could only be expressed in whispers, for to speak it aloud was treason. The crowd was compelled to offer the customary shouts of Felicitor. Good luck to the passing couple, their voices a chorus of coerced celebration. The ceremony itself was a meticulous and perverse imitation of a traditional patrician wedding. A dowry was publicly accounted for. Contracts were signed. Sacrifices were made on the appropriate altars. Every legal and religious box was ticked, creating a veneer of juridical reality over a foundation of absolute absurdity. This painstaking adherence to form was the core of the psychological assault. Nero was not subverting Roman tradition, he was hijacking it, using its most sacred rituals as props in his personal drama. He forced the state, its officials, and its people to become actors in his play, to speak the lines and perform the gestures that gave life to his fantasy. Refusal was not an option. For Sporus, this Roman ceremony was the culmination of his public humiliation. In Greece, he was among the traveling court. Here he was being displayed before the entire world he had once inhabited anonymously. He was the silent, veiled centerpiece of a monstrous civic event, his true identity known to all but acknowledged by none. He was simultaneously the object of pity, ridicule, and fear. The procession was not a celebration of his union but the final ritual of his complete and utter subjugation. He had been physically altered, renamed, and married off in a private trial. Now he had been publicly installed. The Roman state had been made a formal accessory to the act. From this point forward, within the walls of the imperial palace and in all official contexts, Sporus ceased to exist. He was Sabina, the empress. The fiction was now law. The grand delusion was complete. And the daily, grueling performance of inhabiting it was about to begin. The public ceremonies in Roman Greece were the architectural framework of Nero's delusion. The daily life that followed was the painstaking process of furnishing its interior. With the legal and public fiction established, the far more difficult task began, the moment-by-moment, day-by-day enforcement of this new reality within the confines of the imperial court. The persona of the Empress Sabina had to be forged not just for state occasions, but for every waking hour. This was a process of systematic and total transformation, an education in an identity that was not his own, overseen by the emperor and executed by a retinue of attendants. The foundation of this transformation was visual. Sporus was stripped of all remnants of his former life, beginning with his clothing. The simple tunic of a free boy was replaced by the complex and layered attire of the Roman empress. His daily wardrobe would have consisted of an inner tunic, and over it, the traditional floor-length, sleeveless dress, sleeveless dress, reserved for married Roman matrons. The dress was a powerful symbol of modesty and marital fidelity. Its presence on Sporus's body a constant, public paradox. These garments were crafted from the most expensive materials available to the ancient world, fine Egyptian linen, impossibly soft wool, and the ultimate luxury, silk imported at enormous cost from the distant east. They were dyed in vibrant, costly colors, with cherry and purple, a shade reserved for the imperial class, featuring prominently. He would wear a large rectangular shawl that could be draped in a variety of ways to convey status and modesty. According to some historical accounts, Nero compelled Sporus to wear the actual gowns and jewelry that had belonged to Poppaea. This detail, if true, elevates the act from mere imitation to a form of psychological haunting. Sporus was not just being made to look like an empress, he was being forced into the literal, physical space a dead woman had occupied. Her rings were on his fingers, her necklaces on his chest, the scent of her perfumes lingering in the fabric of the clothes he wore. He was a living mannequin, a walking reliquary for Poppaea's possessions. This would have served as a constant, tactile reminder of the ghost he was meant to embody. Each morning began with a lengthy and elaborate ritual of beautification. A team of specialized female slaves would attend to him. His hair, kept long, was the subject of immense effort. Poppaea had been famous for her elaborate coiffures, often featuring intricate braids and curls piled high on the head, a style that required both skill and time to replicate. Hairpieces and wigs were likely used to achieve the necessary volume and complexity. The finished style was a heavy, rigid construct, a sculpted crown that restricted movement and enforced a certain posture. Next came the application of cosmetics. A Roman aristocratic woman's ideal of beauty was a pale, flawless complexion, a sign that she did not have to labor in the sun. To achieve this, Sporus's face would be coated in a base of white lead powder or chalk. This foundation was not only aesthetically unnatural but also toxic, a slow poison applied daily. On this white canvas, color was added with deliberate artistry. Red ochre was used to rouge his cheeks and stain his lips. Soot was carefully applied with a fine brush to darken his eyebrows and outline his eyes, making them appear larger and more dramatic. This daily ritual, lasting several hours, was a process of systematic depersonalization. Staring into a polished bronze or silver mirror, Sporus would watch his own face disappear piece by piece under a mask of artificial femininity. The face that stared back was not his own. It was a painted effigy of the dead empress. Beyond the static elements of dress and cosmetics, Sporus had to learn the dynamic performance of being a Roman matron. This involved a complete re-education of his body and voice. He was coached on his gait, taught to walk with small, measured steps, a dignified and modest movement starkly different from the natural stride of an adolescent boy. He had to learn to sit, stand, and recline with a trained grace, his posture always communicating the dignity expected of his station. A result of his castration was a starting point, but he would have been instructed in the feminine cadences and intonations of aristocratic speech. He would have been surrounded by Poppaea's former ladies-in-waiting, women who had intimately known her mannerisms. They served as his tutors and his guards, their constant presence a reminder of the standard he was expected to meet. Every gesture, every glance, every word was scrutinized, corrected, and rehearsed. He was living in a state of perpetual performance, with the emperor as his director and his life as the forfeit for a flawed delivery. With the persona meticulously crafted in the private workshops of the Domus Aurea, the time came to display the finished creation. Sporus' public appearances as the Empress Sabina were not random or spontaneous. They were carefully choreographed events, designed to normalize the emperor's fantasy and compel its acceptance by the Roman elite. He was not hidden away as a guilty secret, but was instead thrust into the full glare of public life, occupying the specific and highly visible role of the Augusta. His presence became a mandatory feature of court life, a silent testament to Nero's absolute power to redefine reality. One of the primary venues for these appearances was the imperial litter. When the emperor traveled through the streets of Rome or between his various villas, Sporus would be seated beside him, a place of honor traditionally reserved for the empress. The imperial litter was a magnificent affair, an ornate, enclosed couch carried on the shoulders of 8 powerful bearers. Its curtains of fine silk would often be drawn back, allowing the populace to see the imperial couple. This presented a bizarre and unsettling tableau, the familiar face of the emperor alongside a figure who looked like a woman, dressed as the empress, but whose true identity was the subject of rampant and dangerous gossip. Sporus, veiled and silent, became a public spectacle of ambiguity, a living riddle that everyone was expected to accept at face value. He was also required to attend the public games, a cornerstone of Roman political and social life. Seated in the imperial box at the Circus Maximus or in the theatre of Pompey, he was on full display to tens of thousands of Roman citizens. From the senators in their privileged seats to the plebeians in the highest tiers, all eyes would inevitably turn to the imperial couple. Here, in the most public of all Roman settings, the performance had to be flawless. Sporus would have to maintain a composed, regal demeanor for hours on end, reacting to the spectacles in the arena with the appropriate measure of dignified interest or imperial favor. He was not a spectator, he was part of the spectacle itself, a symbol of the emperor's power to create and destroy identity. Perhaps the most psychologically taxing of these public duties were the formal receptions and banquets held within the Golden House. Here, Sporus was not a distant figure in a litter, but a direct participant in the intricate social rituals of the court. He would recline at the banquet table in the position of honor, next to Nero. He was expected to receive the formal greetings of senators, dignitaries, and powerful aristocrats, many of whom despised Nero and saw his arrangement with Sporus as the ultimate symbol of his degeneracy, were forced by political necessity to pay their respects. They would approach, bow their heads, and address this mutilated boy as Domina or Augusta. This forced interaction was a ritual of mutual humiliation. For the senators, it was a galling act of submission to a tyrant's madness. For Sporus, it was a terrifying, undulating experience. He had to engage with the most powerful men in the world, men who knew exactly who and what he was, and maintained the fiction of being the emperor's wife. He was a silent actor, his lines consisting of little more than a nod or a faint, coached smile. Any slip, any moment of revealing his true self, would not only be a personal failure but a political instant with potentially fatal consequences. He was surrounded by people but was utterly alone, isolated by the bizarre and fragile identity that had been forced upon him. Every public appearance was a high-wire act, performed without a net, under the constant, watchful eye of the one man who held the power of life and death over everyone in the room, most of all him. His life was a continuous, waking performance of a role. He had never auditioned for it, in a play from which there was no exit. The enforced public performances of the Empress Sabina were directed at a specific and crucial audience, the Roman senatorial class. For these men, the hereditary custodians of Roman tradition and the theoretical partners in governing the empire, each encounter with Nero's creation was a carefully administered test of loyalty and a lesson in their own powerlessness. Their reactions, however, could not be openly expressed. In the political climate of Nero's later reign, a landscape poisoned by informants and the ever-present threat of treason charges, open dissent was a death sentence. And so, the judgment of the elites was necessarily a silent one, a verdict rendered not in the curia but in the private thoughts, whispered conversations, and ultimately the damning historical records they would leave to posterity. Outwardly, they complied. A senator summoned to a palace banquet would arrive in his finest toga, perform the requisite salutations, and address the veiled figure beside the emperor with the prescribed honorific S. It was a matter of survival, a grim calculus performed by men who had seen their colleagues, friends, and family members forced into suicide or executed on the flimsiest of pretexts. Beneath this veneer of deference, however, a silent ledger of grievances was being meticulously kept. The Sporus affair was, for many, the final and most unforgivable entry in that ledger. It was not merely an act of personal depravity, it was a multifaceted assault on the very foundations of their world. First, it was a profound religious sacrilege. Roman marriage was a sacred institution, a cornerstone of the state designed to produce legitimate children, who could inherit property, carry on the family name, and serve the republic. It was protected by the gods, particularly Juno, and governed by ancient rituals. To see these rituals, the veil, the vows, the joining of hands, so cynically and publicly perverted was, in their eyes, an act of spectacular blasphemy. It mocked the gods and undermined the social fabric. A union that was by its very nature sterile and based on a lie was being presented as an imperial ideal, a gesture of contempt for the ancestral customs that senators considered themselves sworn to protect. Second, it was the ultimate symbol of Nero's descent into absolute tyranny. The affair demonstrated with terrifying clarity that no aspect of Roman life, no law, and no tradition was beyond the reach of his personal whim. He had violated the Lex Cornelia by ordering the castration. He had subverted the legal and social definition of marriage. He had forced the highest officials of the state to participate in a delusion. This was not the act of a first citizen ruling in partnership with the Senate. It was the act of an Oriental despot, a Hellenistic king who believed himself to be a living god, unbound by mortal laws. Sporus, seated beside Nero in the imperial box, was a living monument to the death of the Roman Republican, the senator's own political impotence. Finally, on a deeply personal level, each interaction was a calculated humiliation. For a proud Roman aristocrat whose identity was built on concepts of honor, dignity, and patriarchal authority, being forced to bow and pay homage to a mutilated boy dressed as a woman was a uniquely degrading experience. It was a deliberate act of emasculation, a way for Nero to remind them of their complete subjugation. Their silent compliance was a testament not to their acceptance, but to their fear. This silent judgment found its expression in subtle ways. It could be seen in a glance held a moment too long, in the cold formality that replaced genuine warmth, in the feigned illnesses that allowed a senator to avoid a particularly galling court function. Its most potent form was in the circulation of whispered, bitter witticisms, like the one recorded by Cassius Dio, which served as a small, dangerous release of collective pressure and a reaffirmation of a shared, hidden reality. The true voice of this silent judgment, however, was reserved for the future. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all hailed from this same elite class or wrote for an audience that shared its values. Their histories, written after Nero was dead and his memory officially condemned, are the Senate's posthumous revenge. In their accounts, the Sporus affair is presented as prime evidence of Nero's madness and monstrosity. They recorded every sordid detail with a clinical, condemnatory precision, ensuring that the silent judgment of their peers would become the final, deafening verdict of history. In the moment, they had to be silent to survive. But on the pages of history, their condemnation would be eternal. While the public performances of the Empress Sabina were exercises in political theatre, the daily reality of Sporus's existence unfolded within the gilded cage of the Domus Aurea. Nero's golden house was not merely a palace, it was a sprawling, self-contained universe, a monument to the emperor's solipsisms built on the ashes of the great fire of Rome, Esquiline, and Kellyan Hills. Its grounds were said to encompass a square mile of the city center. According to the historian Suetonius, it was a landscape of manufactured wonders, a vast artificial lake, pastures and woodlands stocked with both wild and domestic animals, and vineyards that mimicked a rustic estate. The villa itself was an architectural marvel of opulence and technological innovation, featuring rooms inlaid with gold, gems, and mother of pearl, and ceilings fitted with revolving panels that scattered flowers and perfumes on the guest below. Its most famous feature was the circular dining room, a circular dining room with a revolving dome that was said to rotate day and night, in time with the heavens. This was Sporus's world. It was a realm of breathtaking beauty and suffocating isolation. Within these walls, the fiction of his identity as Sabina was not a performance. It was the absolute and unchallengeable reality, enforced with the full weight of imperial authority. Every servant, every guard, every courtier who entered his presence was required to address him as Domina and treat him with the deference due to an empress. The slightest slip of the tongue, the accidental use of his old name or the wrong pronoun, would have been an act of treason, not just against the emperor's fantasy, a dangerous enough offense, but against the deified status of the woman he was meant to embody. He was surrounded by hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, yet he was entirely alone, trapped inside the persona Nero had constructed for him. His daily routine would have been one of structured, enforced leisure. He would have had no official duties, no political influence, and no personal agency. His purpose was purely decorative and symbolic. His days were like he spent in the private wing of the palace, moving from one exquisitely appointed room to another. He would have been attended by a retinue of female slaves, the same slaves who constructed his appearance each morning. These women were his constant companions and his jailers, their presence ensuring that the performance of Sabina never lapsed, even in the most private moments. He would eat from golden plates, drink from jeweled cups, and sleep on beds of finest linen, a prisoner of luxury. The psychological pressure of this existence is difficult to fathom. Sporus was living in a state of constant vigilance, always conscious of his posture, his gestures, his speech. He was a method actor in a role from which he could never break character. The environment of the domiciliaria, designed to cater to every physical whim, would have amplified his sense of unreality. Walking through its gilded corridors past walls adorned with priceless frescoes, he was moving through a physical manifestation of the same narcissistic fantasy that had consumed his life. The palace was a reflection of Nero's mind, a world where artifice was valued above nature, and the emperor's will was the only architectural principle. Nero's interactions with him would have been the focal point of this bizarre domestic life. The emperor, according to Suetonius, treated Sporus with all the outward signs of affection he would show a wife, kissing and caressing him in public. These moments of intimacy would have been the most terrifying of all. They were not genuine expressions of affection for Sporus, the person, but for the ghost Nero projected onto him. Sporus was the recipient of Nero's love for a dead woman. A love that had already proven itself to be possessive, violent, and ultimately lethal. He was the object of an obsessive, pathological grief, forced to play the part of a beloved wife to the man who was likely her murderer. Every tender word from the emperor was a reminder of his complete objectification, every touch a violation of his stolen identity. In the opulent, revolving rooms of the Golden House, Sporus was the still, silent center of the emperor's madness, a human doll in a house of illusion. The gilded cage of the Domus Aurea was not a stationary prison. In 66 AD, its walls were metaphorically dissolved and reconstituted around the massive, mobile apparatus of the imperial court as it embarked on its extended tour of Greece. The emperor, his retinue, his praetorian guard, and his newly installed empress was taken on the road. This journey was the culmination of Nero's lifelong Philhellenism, his deep admiration for Greek culture, and his profound personal need to be acclaimed not as a ruler, but as an artist. It was, in essence, a year-long propaganda campaign aimed at solidifying his image as a cultured, divinely gifted sovereign in the part of the empire he most admired. Sporus, in his Poppaea Sabina, was not merely a companion on this journey. He was a central and essential piece of the propaganda. The logistical undertaking of moving the imperial court was immense. A train of thousands, administrators, servants, soldiers, and entertainers snaked its way across the Adriatic and through the provinces of Achaea. At its heart was the imperial couple. In every city they entered, from the bustling port of Corinth to the ancient intellectual heart of Athens. Their arrival was a meticulously staged event. Sporus, dressed in the full regalia of the empress, would ride in a litter alongside Nero, a silent, beautiful symbol of domestic stability and imperial majesty. For the Greek provincials, who had long been accustomed to the divine pretensions of Hellenistic kings, the sight of an emperor traveling with his wife was a familiar projection of power and order. The grotesque reality behind the facade was a secret reserved for the Roman inner circle. Sporus functioned during this tour's twofold. First, he was a link to the deified Poppaea, who had also been known for her Philhellenic sympathies. By presenting Sporus as her living embodiment, Nero was invoking her memory and grafting it onto his own activities in Greece. He was, in effect, traveling with a ghost that was beloved and respected in this part of the world, lending a sense of continuity and divine sanction to his artistic pilgrimage. At religious festivals and temple visits, Sporus' presence as Divus Abina was a powerful, if blasphemous, gesture, blending imperial piety with personal obsession. Second, Sporus served as a constant, regal counterpoint to Nero's own unconventional behavior. While the emperor took to the stage, strumming his lyre and singing in competitions, behaving more like a traveling performer than a Roman ruler, Sporus remained in the position of honor, the still, silent figure in the imperial box. His presence lent a necessary veneer of imperial gravity to the proceedings. He was the anchor of tradition that allowed Nero to drift into his theatrical fantasies. The spectacle was not merely Nero the actor, but the emperor and empress presiding over the sacred games. It reframed Nero's self-indulgence as an official act of state, a cultural engagement undertaken by the imperial family. For Sporus, this year-long journey was an ordeal of constant, unrelenting public exposure in an ever-changing environment. It was one thing to maintain the performance within the familiar, controlled setting of the palace, it was another to do so while constantly on the move, under the gaze of countless new and curious faces. Every day brought a new city, a new procession, a new set of dignitaries to be received, a new public event to be endured. The physical discomfort of travel, the dust of the road, the oppressive heat of the Greek summer, all had to be borne with the serene, uncomplaining grace of an empress. The weight of the elaborate hairstyles, the constricting garments, and the heavy jewelry was a constant physical burden, a bodily manifestation of the psychological weight of his false identity. The Greek tour, which was for Nero the apex of his life, a fantasy of artistic glory made real, was for Sporus the expansion of his prison to encompass an entire country. The gilded bars of his cage were no longer made of marble and gold, but of the unblinking stares of a million strangers. He was perhaps the most famous and yet the least known person in the Roman Empire, his face a celebrated mask, his true self an erased memory. The victory wreaths Nero collected at each stop were laurels for a phantom victory. The cheers of the Greek crowds were applause for a grand, horrifying illusion, and Sporus was its silent, living centerpiece. The culmination of the Greek tour was not a quiet return to the capital but a grand, theatrical climax, a formal Roman triumph. The triumph was the highest and most sacred honor a Roman could achieve, a lavish procession traditionally granted, a lay to a general who had won a major victory against a foreign enemy, killing at least 5,000 foes in a single battle. It was a ritual of immense religious and significance, a celebration of Roman military might that concluded with a sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. Nero, however, had conquered no armies. His victories were on the stages of Olympia and Delphi. He had defeated not enemy generals, but local musicians and poets. Yet, he decreed that his artistic achievements warranted the full spectacle of a military triumph, an act of supreme arrogance that replaced the celebration of Roman martial valor with the glorification of his own artistic ego. In this carefully orchestrated piece of political theater, Sporus, as the Empress Sabina, played an unnegotiable and symbolically crucial role. The procession was designed to present a specific narrative to the people of Rome, and the presence of the empress was essential to that narrative's coherence. The preparations were extensive. According to Suetonius, part of the city wall was demolished to allow the emperor's entry, a tradition reserved for the victors of the sacred games, which Nero now applied to the city of Rome itself. The procession route was lined with thousands of citizens, marshaled into place by the Praetorian Guard. The spectacle began. At the head of the procession were floats, not laden with captured enemy armor and weapons, but displaying the 18 had collected. Banners did not list the names of conquered tribes and cities, but the titles of the songs he had sung in the plays in which he had performed. Musicians filled the air not with martial hymns, but with the melodies of Nero's own compositions. It was a military ritual hollowed out and refilled with the content of an artistic festival. Then came the centerpiece, the triumphal chariot, a gilded, circular carriage drawn by 4 white horses. In it stood Nero, no longer in the garb of an artist, but in the full regalia of a triumphator. He wore the purple tunic embroidered with gold palm leaves, and over it the solid purple toga decorated with golden stars. On his head was a laurel crown, and in his hand an ivory scepter. But he was not alone. Standing beside him, where the children of a victorious general might traditionally have stood, was Sporus, dressed as the empress, resplendent in imperial purple and veiled in the flame-colored veil. Sporus was the silent linchpin of the entire spectacle. The semiotics of his presence were complex and deliberate. First, he was the symbol of domestic harmony and legitimacy. The imperial family was supposed to be the model for all Roman families. By presenting himself with his wife at his moment of supreme glory, Nero was projecting an image of a stable, traditional household, a visual lie that papered over the chaotic and murderous reality of his personal life. The presence of the empress provided a necessary veneer of tradition and propriety to an otherwise radically unconventional event. Second, Sporus was the physical link to the divine. He was Sabina, the living effigy of the deified Poppaea. His presence in the chariot transformed the procession from a mere act of personal vanity into an event with quasi-religious overtones. It implied that Nero's artistic victories were sanctioned by the gods, that his talent was a divine gift, and that his deified wife was present to bear witness to his glory. He was not just an emperor or an artist. He was a celestial being, sharing his triumph with his divine consort. Most profoundly, Sporus was the ultimate spoil of war. A triumph's central purpose was to display the fruits of conquest, captured treasure, exotic animals, and high-ranking prisoners of war paraded in chains. In Nero's war against reality, law, and nature, Sporus was the single greatest prize. His presence in the chariot was the public exhibition of Nero's most radical victory. He had conquered the constraints of biology, bent the laws of the state to his will, and forced society to accept his personal delusion as public truth. Sporus, silent and beautiful, was the living proof of Nero's absolute power. He was not a person in that chariot, he was a trophy, the ultimate symbol of a conquered reality, paraded through the streets for all to see. As the procession wound its way toward the Capitoline Hill for the final sacrifice, Sporus stood as a testament to the fact that for this emperor, the entire world, and everyone in it, was merely a prop for the stage of his own imagination. Within the hermetically sealed world of the imperial court, power was not a static, monolithic entity residing solely with the emperor. It was a fluid and dangerous ecosystem, and the figure who navigated its currents with the most ruthless skill was Gaius of Oanius Linus. As prefect of the Praetorian Guard, he commanded the only significant military force in the capital, making him the ultimate enforcer of the emperor's will and a guarantor of his security. But he was more than just a bodyguard. He was Nero's closest advisor, his confidant in debauchery, and his co-conspirator in the political purges that characterized the latter half of his reign. Linus was a man of low birth who had risen through a combination of sycophancy, cunning, and a complete lack of moral scruple. His influence over Nero was immense, and his gaze, therefore, was a matter of life and death. The relationship between Linus and Sporus was one of necessity and unspoken tension. For Linus, Sporus was not a rival for the emperor's affections in the conventional sense. The prefect's power was rooted in his ability to cater to and facilitate Nero's darkest impulses, a role that Sporus, as a passive object of obsession, could not fulfill. Instead, Linus would have viewed Sporus as a tool, a symptom of the emperor's psychological state that could be managed and exploited. He had played a key role in the public acceptance of the marriage, hosting the grand wedding feast in Rome. This was a calculated political act. By publicly endorsing the union, Linus demonstrated his absolute, unquestioning loyalty to Nero, placing himself at the very center of the emperor's new reality. He signaled to all other courtiers that he was the chief facilitator of the imperial fantasy, the high priest of this strange new cult. His daily interactions with Sporus would have been governed by this political calculus. In public, Linus would have treated Sporus with the exaggerated deference due to an empress. He would have been the first to bow, the first to use the honorific domina, his performance a model for the rest of the court. This was not a sign of respect, but a display of his own power, the power to enforce the emperor's truth. He understood that Sporus' position was entirely dependent on Nero's whim. The boy was not a source of power, but a reflection of it. By honoring the reflection, Linus paid tribute to the source. In private, his demeanor would have been far more complex. He would have seen Sporus as a barometer of the emperor's mood and mental stability. The degree of Nero's obsession, the amount of time and resources he lavished on the empress, provided Linus with valuable data for managing his volatile master. He would have observed their interactions, noting what pleased the emperor and what did not, using Sporus as a proxy to understand Nero's psychological landscape. The gaze of Tigellinus must have been a unique source of terror. Nero's madness was passionate and, in its own way, predictable. Tigellinus's attention was cold, analytical, and utterly pragmatic. Sporus would have understood that this man felt nothing for him, not pity, not contempt, not desire, but saw him only in terms of his utility. He was an asset in the prefect's portfolio of influence, to be maintained as long as he served a purpose and discarded the moment he became a liability. There was also an element of unspoken threat. Tigellinus was the master of Nero's secret police, the man who orchestrated the arrests and forced suicides. His power was built on fear. Sporus, living in a state of absolute vulnerability, would have been acutely aware that his life depended not only on pleasing Nero, but also on not displeasing Tigellinus. The prefect was the gatekeeper. Any complaint he might make to Nero about Sporus' behavior, any suggestion that the boy was not perfectly fulfilling his role, could have been a death sentence. Sporus was thus caught between two forms of tyranny, the all-consuming, obsessive fantasy of the emperor and the cold, calculating political reality of his chief enforcer. He had to perform not just for Nero's affection, but for Tigellinus's approval. His existence was a delicate balancing act, a constant navigation of the treacherous space between a madman and his monster. While Nero was absorbed in the theater of his personal life, staging triumphs for artistic victories and forcing his court to participate in the fantasy of his marriage, the foundations of the Roman Empire were beginning to fracture. The grand illusion of stability and prosperity, so carefully maintained through propaganda and brutal suppression, was cracking under the weight of official mismanagement, military discontent, and the growing alienation of the provincial elites. Read in the Domus Aurea, these distant tremors would have manifested as subtle shifts in the atmosphere of the court. A new tension in the faces of the guards, hushed conversations in corridors that ceased the moment he approached, and a growing, palpable anxiety around the emperor himself. The first major shockwave came from the west. In March of 68 AD, Gaius Julius Viindex, the governor of Gallia-Dunsins, modern-day France, openly revolted against Nero. Viindex was a Roman senator of Gallic aristocratic descent, and his rebellion was not a bid for personal power, but a direct and public denunciation of Nero's tyranny. He issued proclamations condemning the emperor's extravagant spending, his neglect of the armies, his scandalous artistic performances, and most damningly, his murder of his own mother. Viindex called for the liberation of the human race from this monster and declared his support for Servius Sulpicius Galba, the respected, elderly governor of Hispania-Tarraconensis, Spain, as the new emperor. Nero's initial reaction to the news, as reported by Suetonius, was one of startling nonchalance. He was in Naples at the time, and upon hearing of the revolt, he reportedly showed more concern about an invention for a new type of water organ than the loss of a major province. He spoke of the rebellion with contempt, confident that it could be easily crushed. For several days, he refused to take any official action, continuing to attend the local gymnasium and practice his music. This apparent calm was a facade, a desperate attempt to project an image of unshakable control. For the court, however, including Sporus, this period would have been thick with an unspoken dread. The emperor's theatrical indifference was more frightening than any outburst of rage, as it signaled a dangerous detachment from a reality that could no longer be ignored. As the situation escalated, Nero's composure began to crumble. The rebellion in Gaul was not an isolated incident. More importantly, Galba, a man of consular rank with a distinguished military career, had accepted Viindex's call and declared himself the legate of the Senate in the Roman people, a carefully chosen title that positioned him not as a usurper, but as a restorer of traditional authority. The legions in Spain had proclaimed him emperor. Suddenly, the threat was no longer a provincial squabble. It was a full-blown civil war, with a credible rival for the throne. The news from Spain shattered the bubble of the imperial court. Nero rushed back to Rome, his mind now consumed by the crisis. The atmosphere in the Domus Aurea would have transformed from a stage for artistic pageantry to the frantic, paranoid headquarters of a failing regime. Nero's behavior became increasingly erratic. He swung wildly between grandiose plans to sail to Alexandria and fits of violent despair. He proposed bizarre and horrific schemes for punishing the rebellious provinces, including a wholesale massacre of all Gauls living in Rome. For Sporus, this period was the beginning of the end of the world he had known. His role as the living ghost of Poppaea, once the central focus of the emperor's life, became secondary to the urgent and all-consuming struggle for survival. The elaborate rituals of his daily life, the coaching, the cosmetic preparations, would have continued, but they would have felt increasingly hollow and absurd against the backdrop of impending collapse. He was no longer the centerpiece of a grand fantasy, but a relic of a self-indulgent piece that had vanished. The emperor's gaze, which had once been a constant, obsessive presence, was now distracted, darting, and filled with a fear that Sporus had never seen before. The psychological cage in which he lived was still locked, but its foundations were being shaken apart by the tramp of distant, approaching legions. The silence in the Golden House was no longer one of suffocating control, but of terrified anticipation, and the theater itself was about to be torn down. The political disintegration, once begun, proceeded with astonishing speed. The revolt of V-Index, though crushed on the battlefield by the Rhine legions, had irrevocably broken the spell of Nero's invincibility. The defection of Galba in Spain provided a new, credible center of gravity for the disaffected elements of the state. Soon, the governor of Africa, Clodius Macer, and the legions under his command also renounced their allegiance. The empire was unraveling thread by thread, and the news that reached Rome grew more dire with each passing day. The terminal event, however, occurred not in a distant province, but within the city itself in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard. Their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, a colleague of the now absentee Gellinus, saw the tide turning and made a decisive move. He promised the guards a massive donative, a cash bonus in Galba's name, and with that promise, he purchased their loyalty. The men sworn to protect the emperor's life had been sold to his rival. Nero's authority in the capital had evaporated overnight. The final hours in the Domus Aurea were a scene of surreal and pathetic abandonment. According to Suetonius, Nero went to bed late, after a banquet, only to awaken around midnight to a terrifying silence. The soldiers who had stood watch outside his bedchamber were gone. He rose and sent frantic messages to his friends and courtiers, summoning them to his side. No one came. He then began to wander the vast, empty corridors of his golden palace, calling out for his attendants, his voice echoing in the deserted halls. The palace, once a bustling universe of servants, guards, and sycophants, had become a mausoleum, its opulent rooms silent witnesses to his isolation. Every door he opened revealed another empty chamber, another betrayal. The grand stage he had built for himself was now deserted. The entire cast had abandoned the play. His psychological state evolved into a sequence of frantic, contradictory impulses. He called for a gladiator to come and kill him, but the request was met with silence. He contemplated fleeing to Parthia, the empire's traditional enemy, or throwing himself at the mercy of Galba. He drafted a pathetic speech which he planned to deliver from the rostra, hoping to win back the people's affection through his rhetorical and artistic skill. He was a performer to the last, convinced that the right oration, the perfect delivery could reverse the march of legions and the reality of his own political death. But upon realizing that he would likely be torn to pieces before he could even reach the forum, he abandoned the idea. It was in this state of abject terror and indecision that the final desperate plan was hatched, to flee the city and take refuge in a suburban villa owned by his loyal freedman, Poppaea, located a few miles outside Rome. The escape party was a small, pathetic remnant of his once magnificent court. It consisted of just 4 people: his 3 most trusted freedmen, Epiphanes, his secretary, Neophyteus, and Poppaea himself and Sporus. The inclusion of Sporus in this desperate fight is a detail of profound psychological significance. He was not a bodyguard, an advisor, or a strategist. He possessed no skills that would be useful to a fugitive. His presence served no practical purpose. He was, instead, the last living artifact of Nero's shattered fantasy. In a world where every friend had betrayed him and every symbol of his power had been stripped away, Sporus was the one creation that remained. A human security blanket, the ghost of an empress who could bear silent witness to the emperor's final tragedy. The escape took place under the cover of darkness. The performance of Empress was over, its elaborate costumes and rituals rendered meaningless by the brutal urgency of the situation. Sporus was likely dressed in a simple, inconspicuous male tunic, his identity as Sabina packed away like a theatrical costume after the final curtain. Nero himself was disguised in a worn, dark cloak, his head covered in the cloth held over his face. The small group mounted horses and slipped out of the palace, making their way through the darkened streets of the city. The flight was a grim inversion of his triumphal procession. No cheering crowds, only the fear of recognition. Suetonius records that as they rode, the earth trembled with a minor tremor, and a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, omens that Nero interpreted as the god's final judgment. They heard the shouts of soldiers from a nearby camp, hailing Galba and cursing Nero, unaware that the object of their scorn was riding past in the darkness. The flight from the capital was not just a political retreat. It was the final, ignominious exit of a performer booed off the stage of history, dragging the silent, human prop of his greatest delusion with him into the dark. The villa of the freedman Poppaea was located between the Via Salarium, a modest property that offered a temporary, desperate refuge. The final approach to the villa was impassable on horseback, forcing the fugitives to dismount. Nero, the man who had once glided through Rome in a gilded litter, was now forced to scramble through a thicket of reeds and thorns, crawling on his hands and knees to reach a dark, subterranean passage that led into the back of the house. He was offered a piece of coarse bread, which he rejected, but drank a little tepid water from a cup, a final humiliation for a man accustomed to the finest wines. He threw himself down on a simple mattress with a worn covering and waited. The atmosphere in the small, cramped rooms of the villa was one of impending doom. Messengers brought news from the city, each report more dire than the last. The Senate, emboldened by the Praetorians' defection, had met and formally declared Nero a public enemy, a hostis publicus. This was not merely a condemnation, it was a death sentence. It meant that any Roman citizen had the legal right and, indeed, the duty to kill him on sight, without trial. A formal search party was already on its way, with orders to capture him alive and bring him back to Rome for the traditional punishment, to be stripped naked, his head locked in a forked stick, and then to be flogged to death in the Forum. This was the end. There would be no escape to Parthia, no appeal to the people. The only choice left was the manner of his death. For a Roman aristocrat, suicide was the final act of personal agency, a way to escape the ultimate humiliation of public execution and preserve a final shred of dignity. Nero's companions urged him to take his own life before the soldiers arrived, but the emperor, the man who had ordered the deaths of so many with a casual word, found himself incapable of the act, his nerve failing him. He wept, lamenting the loss to the world of such a great artist. "What an artist dies in me," he cried, "what an artist dies in me." It was his own epitaph, a final, perfect expression of his all-consuming narcissism. He ordered his companions to dig a grave, a pit of the precise dimensions of his own body. He had them collect scraps of marble to decorate it, and to fetch water and wood for the rites of his funeral. As they worked, he wept, repeating his famous lament over and over. Sporus was a witness to all of this. He stood in the shadows of the small room, watching the complete psychological collapse of the man who had been his god and his monster. He saw the abject terror, the self-pity, the pathetic, theatrical indecision of the absolute ruler who was now just a frightened man in a dirty room. For Sporus, this scene must have been a moment of profound and terrifying clarity. The entire edifice of his own life, the fabricated identity of Sabina, had been built on this man's will. Now, he was watching that would dissolve into a puddle of fear and regret. The sound of approaching horsemen finally broke the spell of his paralysis. The search party was closing in. Realizing there was no more time, Nero placed a dagger to his throat. But even then, he could not bring himself to push it in. It was his freedman and secretary, Epiphanes, who provided the final impetus, placing his own hand over Nero's and forcing the blade home. The emperor was dying as the soldiers burst into the room. A centurion, seeing him bleeding on the floor, rushed to his side, pretending he had come to help. Too late, Nero gasped. This is fidelity. With those final, cynical words, his eyes bulged in a horrific, lifeless stare that, according to Suetonius, filled all who saw it with terror. He was dead. In the immediate aftermath there was chaos. But Sporus in that moment was no longer the Empress Sabina. He was no longer Nero's possession. He was simply a boy, a teenager who had just witnessed the violent death of his captor, the creator of his torment. The fall of Nero was not, for him, a liberation. It was a transfer of ownership. He was now a spoil of war, a piece of the dead emperor's property to be claimed. He had been a silent witness at the deathbed of a tyrant. But his own long, drawn-out execution was just beginning. The curtain had fallen on one tragedy, only to rise immediately on another. With the death of the emperor, the fragile, hermetic reality of the last 9 years shattered into 1,000 pieces. In the immediate chaos within Paeon's villa, Sporus ceased to be the Empress Sabina. That identity was a construct of Nero's will, and with the extinguishing of that will, the persona dissolved, leaving behind a terrified youth in a cheap tunic, standing over the cooling body of his captor. The soldiers who had stormed the room saw not an empress, but a piece of imperial property, an exotic curiosity to be secured along with the dead emperor's signet ring and dagger. His ephemeral state and forced femininity was stripped away in an instant, leaving him exposed and undefined, a legal and social phantom. The brief, violent interlude between Nero's last breath and the arrival of a new authority was perhaps the only moment of true non-existence for Sporus. No longer a boy, no longer an empress, just a survivor awaiting designation. That designation was not long in coming. News of Nero's death traveled back to Rome with the speed of a military dispatch. The man who received this news with the greatest interest was Nymphidius Sabinus. As Praetorian prefect, he was now the de facto military master of Rome. He was a man consumed by an ambition that vastly outstripped his station. He had been instrumental in turning the guard against Nero, but his ultimate goal was not merely to serve a new master, but to become one. He had already begun to circulate a self-serving rumor that he was the illegitimate son of the former Emperor Caligula, a fiction designed to give him a tenuous link to the Julio-Claudian bloodline. With Nero dead and Galba still far away in Spain, Nymphidius saw a power vacuum, and he intended to fill it. His strategy for consolidating power was to seize control of all the assets and symbols of the fallen regime. This meant securing the treasury, controlling the grain supply, and, most importantly, appropriating the symbolic remnants of Nero's imperial household. Among these remnants, Sporus was the most potent and visible prize. He was the living embodiment of Nero's private world, the most intimate symbol of his quasi-divine prerogatives. To possess Sporus was to make a public and audacious statement of succession. It was a way of demonstrating that he, Nymphidius, had not just overthrown the emperor, but had inherited him. The claim was made swiftly and without ceremony. Soldiers acting on the prefect's orders would have taken custody of Sporus at the villa, separating him from the freedmen who were now witnesses to a regicide. He was transported back to the city, not to the Domus Aurea, but likely to Nymphidius' own lavish residence or the Praetorian barracks. He had gone from being the property of a delusional artist to the property of a ruthless political operator. Nymphidius' treatment of Sporus was a grotesque parody of Nero's. He too began to refer to Sporus as Poppaea. He compelled Sporus to maintain the feminine persona, effectively stepping into Nero's role as the husband, but the motivation was entirely different. For Nero, this was a matter of deep-seated psychological obsession. For Nymphidius, it was a cold, cynical political calculation. By taking Nero's wife, he was engaging in a form of symbolic usurpation. He was attempting to absorb Nero's imperial mystique, to create a sense of continuity in which power had been seamlessly transferred from the dead emperor to himself. He paraded Sporus before his own men and political allies, a living trophy that signified his new status as the master of Nero's legacy. For Sporus, this was a new and perhaps more terrifying form of imprisonment. Nero's fantasy, while monstrous, had a kind of internal artistic logic. Nymphidius' appropriation of him was devoid of any such complexity. It was the blunt, pragmatic act of a gangster claiming the possessions of a fallen rival. He was a spoil of war, and his new owner was determined to display him as such. The brief hope of liberation that might have flickered in the moments after Nero's death, with a new one built around him, with a new, and far more dangerous, keeper at the door. The reign of Nymphidius Sabinus, a brief and bloody footnote in the chaos of 68 AD, was for Sporus a lateral move from one form of objectification to another. The nature of his captivity had changed. With Nero, he was a quasi-religious icon in a private cult of memory. With Nymphidius, he was a crude political asset, a piece of plunder to be publicly displayed. But the duration of this new ownership was to be measured in weeks, not years, as Nymphidius strutted through Rome, attempting to consolidate his power and imagining himself a new Caesar. The real Caesar, Servius Sulpicius Galba, was marching slowly and deliberately from Spain, his advance a harbinger of a new and severe political order. Galba was the antithesis of Nero in every conceivable way. He was 73 years old, a man of ancient, republican lineage, known for his rigid discipline, his stern demeanor, and above all, his frugality, a quality that his detractors called avarice. He represented a return to the old Roman virtues of austerity, gravity, and martial order. The news of his approach sent a chill through the Nero neon holdovers in the capital. The city began to purge itself of the symbols of the fallen regime, and there was no more potent symbol of Nero neon excess and moral decay than Sporus, the boy empress currently in the custody of the would-be usurper Nymphidius. Nymphidius, blinded by ambition, failed to read the changing political climate. He believed his control of the Praetorian Guard gave him leverage over the approaching emperor. He sent envoys to Galba, demanding to be made the sole Praetorian prefect for life, a position of unprecedented power. When Galba rebuffed his demands, Nymphidius made his final, fatal miscalculation. Convinced he could sway the Praetorians, he had a speech prepared and intended to have himself declared emperor in their camp. But the loyalty of the Guard was a commodity, not an ideal. They had abandoned Nero for a promised bonus. They would not support Nymphidius against the legitimate, Senate-endorsed emperor, especially when it became clear that Galba's legions were far more powerful than their own cohort. The end for Nymphidius was swift and ignominious. As he entered the Praetorian camp to make his bid for the throne, he found not an expectant audience, but a cohort of soldiers who had already reaffirmed their allegiance to Galba. The gates were shut behind him. He was trapped. He was dispatched by the swords and javelins of his own men, his ambitious grasp for power ending in a pool of blood on the barracks floor. With his death, Sporus was once again left masterless. He was no longer the political pawn of a usurper. He was now the unclaimed property of a dead traitor, an embarrassing and problematic piece of human wreckage left over from a regime the new order was determined to erase. When Galba's agents arrived in Rome to secure the city ahead of the emperor's arrival, they were faced with the question of what to do with the remnants of Nero's and Nymphidius' households. Sporus was chief among them. He was taken into the custody of the new administration, the transfer of quiet, bureaucratic procedure. His situation under Galba's nascent reign was one of profound uncertainty and quiet dread. He was a living relic of an era that was now officially condemned. The austerity of the new regime had no place for such a figure. Galba was a man who famously grumbled at the cost of an elaborate dinner. He would have looked upon Sporus as the ultimate embodiment of the wasteful, decadent, and unnatural world he had come to cleanse. Sporus was likely kept in seclusion, a shameful secret to be managed. He was no longer Sabina, but he was also not quite Sporus. He was a problem, a living piece of evidence of the depravity of his two previous masters. In the cold, severe dawn of gallant sledges and restored traditions, there was no category for a boy who had been an empress. He was a ghost from a carnival that had been shut down, waiting in the shadows to see what the new, stern management had in store for him. The austere new era promised by Galba proved to be both brief and brutal. His reign, which began in June of 68 AD, was destined to last a mere 7 months. The very qualities that had recommended him to the Senate, his discipline, His adherence to tradition, his fiscal conservatism, proved to be his political undoing. Rome, after a decade of Nero's lavish spectacles and populist handouts, was not ready for an emperor who believed in balanced budget. Galba's most catastrophic error was his refusal to pay the enormous donative that Nymphidius Sabinus had promised the Praetorian Guard in his name. His declaration that he levied soldiers, not bought them, was a statement of high republican principle, but in the pragmatic, transcational world of military politics, it was a fatal miscalculation. He alienated the only soldiers who could protect him. For Sporus, these months were a period of precarious suspended animation. He was a non-person, held in a state of administrative limbo within the imperial palace, which was now being stripped of its Neronian excesses. The vibrant frescoes were perhaps covered, the golden statues removed. The atmosphere was one of severe, joyless correction. In this environment, Sporus was the ultimate contaminant, a living symbol of the moral sickness the new regime was meant to cure. His survival depended on his invisibility. He was likely confined to a remote wing of the palace, his needs met by a skeleton staff who would have regarded him with a mixture of fear and contempt. He was no longer a performer, but he was not yet free. He was an artifact awaiting a final disposition, his fate in the hands of a stern old man who had no use for him and every reason to dispose of him. The political vacuum created by Galba's unpopularity was soon filled. Marcus Salvius Otho, a man of noble Etruscan lineage, had been one of the earliest and most enthusiastic supporters of Galba's bid for the throne. He was also a figure inextricably linked to the Neronian past. In his youth he had been one of Nero's closest companions, a partner in his nocturnal revelries. More significantly, Otho was the first husband of Poppaea Sabina. It was Otho who had introduced the beautiful Poppaea to the emperor, only to have Nero become infatuated, force their divorce, and banish Otho to the remote governorship of Lusitania, modern Portugal, for 10 years. Otho had lived in exile, nursing a decade-long grievance, while the woman he loved became first Nero's mistress, then his empress, was likely murdered by him, and was finally deified, expecting to be named Galba's heir as a reward for his support. Otho was publicly snubbed when the old emperor instead adopted a young, unknown aristocrat. This humiliation was the final catalyst. On January 15, 16 AD, Otho put his own conspiracy into motion. He went to the Praetorian camp and, capitalizing on their anger over the denied donative, offered to pay them what they were owed and more. The Guard, having no loyalty to the stingy Galba, acclaimed Otho as the new emperor. They marched into the city and cornered Galba in the Roman Forum. The 73-year-old emperor was thrown from his litter and hacked to death, his head paraded on a spear. By the end of the day, Otho, the ghost from Nero's past, was the master of the Roman world. With oath or succession, the political and cultural climate of Rome shifted seismically once again. Otho actively cultivated a Neronian nostalgia. He restored Nero statues, allowed himself to be hailed by the people as Nero Otho, and brought back many of the former emperor's freedmen and courtiers. His reign was a deliberate and popular revival of the Neronian style, a return to the largescent theatricality that Galba had tried to stamp out. Sporus' status was instantly transformed. He was no longer an embarrassing relic to be hidden, but a precious link to the very past Otho was seeking to resurrect. The transfer of custody was immediate. Sporus was moved from the anonymous imperial property roles into the personal household of the new emperor. Otho, the man who had been Poppaea Sabina's first and perhaps only true husband, now took possession of her living effigy. This act was one of profound and twisted psychological resonance. For Otho, Sporus was not just an imitation of Nero's wife. He was an imitation of his wife. He was a vessel for a different, but equally potent, memory. Began to call Sporus Poppaea. He treated him with a strange, melancholic tenderness, as if in Sporus he could reclaim a shadow of the woman who had been stolen from him. For Sporus, this was the ultimate cruelty. He was recast in the same role, forced to wear the same name and the same identity, but for a new audience of one. He was a living palimpsest, the memory of Nero's obsession now overwritten with the memory of Otho's loss. His torment had become a transferable commodity, passed from one emperor to the next, his own identity buried ever deeper under the weight of another man's grief. The court of Emperor Otho was a haunted space, a deliberate reconstruction of a lost world. The return of Nero neon aesthetics and personnel was not merely a political strategy to win popular support, it was a reflection of Otho's own complex and unresolved past. He had been a player in the original drama, a man who had lost his wife and his position to the whims of a tyrant. Now, as the master of Rome, he seemed driven to collect the scattered fragments of that past and reassemble them, perhaps in an attempt to finally make sense of his own story. In this strange, nostalgic court, Sporus was the most prized and the most tragic acquisition. His life under Otho was a surreal echo of his life with Nero, but with a profoundly different emotional tenor. Nero's treatment of Sporus was that of an artist obsessed with his creation, possessive, demanding, unrooted in a narcissistic fantasy. Otho's behavior, as suggested by the historical sources, was colored by a genuine, if deeply pathological, sense of grief and loss. He was not trying to create Poppaea anew. He was trying to create Poppaea anew. He was trying to commune with her ghost through the vessel of Sporus. His interactions were likely gentler, more melancholic. When he called Sporus Poppaea, it was not a command enforcing a new identity, but a whisper to a memory. This gentler form of cruelty may have been, for Sporus, the most psychologically damaging of all. Nero's tyranny was absolute and unambiguous. It was the clear and present violence of a captor. Otho's treatment was a far more insidious form of violation. He was, in a sense, forcing Sporus to participate in his own private mourning. Sporus was no longer just an object of an emperor's fantasy, but the focal point of his grief, and the affection that Otho still felt for a woman who had been dead for 3 years. He was being used as a therapeutic object, a living memento through which Otho could process his own trauma. Sporus was once again adorned in the finery of an empress. He was treated with a public deference that must have felt like a terrible, recurring dream. He attended the new emperor at banquets and public appearances, a silent, beautiful figure at his side, but the audience had changed. The Roman elite, who had complied with Nero's demands out of fear, now looked upon this arrangement with a different kind of judgment. Otho was popular, but his revival of Nero neon costumes, with Sporus as the centerpiece, was a clear sign to the aristocracy that the moral and political rot of the previous reign had not been excised. It was simply under new management. For them, Sporus was a constant reminder of the instability and decadence that seemed to be an incurable feature of the imperial system. The most disturbing aspect of Sporus' situation was his complete and utter lack of a future. He was trapped in a temporal loop, condemned to endlessly reenact the role of a dead woman. First, he was the ghost of Nero's dead wife. Now, he was the ghost of Otho's dead wife. His own identity, the person he might have become, had been so thoroughly erased that it was no longer a consideration. He was a vessel, defined only by the memories that others poured into him. His existence was entirely relational and retrospective. He had no independent being. This strange, melancholic interlude was, like everything in that chaotic year, destined to be short-lived. Otho's claim to the throne was not uncontested. Before Galba's death, the powerful legions stationed on the Rhine had already acclaimed their own commander, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. Vitellius was now marching on Italy. The brief, nostalgic dream of Otho's Nero neon revival was about to collide with the brutal reality of another, more powerful army. It had just entered its next phase. For Sporus, living as a ghost reminder in Otho's court, the news of Vitellius's approach would have been yet another tremor signaling the imminent collapse of his world. He was about to be inherited once again, his fate passed along the bloody chain of succession like a piece of cursed jewelry. Each new master brought with him a new form of torment, a new way to use and abuse the boy who had once been an empress. The brief phantom spring of Otho's Nero neon revival was destined to be consumed by the harsh reality of civil war. From the north, the legions of Aulus Vitellius, the governor of Germania Inferior, descended upon Italy. They were hardened veterans of the Rhine frontier, a formidable military force loyal to their commander, a man notorious for his gluttony and populist appeal among the soldiery. The other, the brute force of the frontier, met in northern Italy in April of 16 AD. At the First Battle of Bedriacum, near Cremona, Otho's forces, despite fighting bravely, were decisively defeated. Otho's reaction to this military catastrophe was, to many, startlingly noble and entirely out of character for a man who had seized power through assassination. Upon receiving news of the defeat, he resolved to end the civil war and prevent further Roman bloodshed. He gathered his remaining friends and officers, calmly explained his decision, and put his affairs in order. That night, he retired to his tent and took his own life with a single dagger thrust to the heart. So different from Nero's panicked and pathetic end, was seen by later historians like Tacitus as a final, redeeming act of a flawed man, an attempt to spare the state the prolonged agony of a protracted conflict. In the immediate aftermath of Otho's death, his entire household, the imperial household, became the de facto property of the victor. This was the brutal, transactional logic of Roman civil war. The transfer included slaves, freedmen, administrators, and the contents of the imperial treasury. And within that vast inventory of human and material assets was Sporus. His third master in less than a year was now Aulus Vitellius. Once again, without any action or choice of his own, he was passed from the dead to the living, a piece of imperial inheritance to be disposed of at the new owner's pleasure. Vitellius was a different kind of ruler from his immediate predecessors. He lacked the artistic pretensions of Nero and the melancholic, aristocratic bearing of Otho. He was a man of coarse appetites, a populist whose power was rooted in his ability to indulge his soldiers in the Roman mob. His march to Rome was a slow, shambling affair, marked by feasting, drunken revelry, and a general breakdown of military discipline. When he finally entered the city, he did so at the head of his army, treating the capital not as his seat of government but as a conquered city. His perception of Sporus was entirely devoid of the psychological complexities that had defined the boy's existence under Nero and Otho. For Vitellius, Sporus was neither a resurrected ghost nor a political symbol of succession. He was a famous curiosity, a celebrity of perversion. He was the living punchline to a joke about the decadence, undone naturalness of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and its immediate successor. Vitellius, seeking to position himself as a man of the people, a bluff soldier in contrast to the effete artists who came before him, saw in Sporus an opportunity for a particularly cruel form of public entertainment. There was no pretense of continuing the fiction of Poppaea. The name was dropped, the finery was likely put away. Sporus was reverted, in title at least, back to his own identity. It was a rebranding. He was no longer an object of private, imperial obsession, but an object of public, popular ridicule. The court of Vitellius was a brutal and boisterous affair. Sporus would have been exhibited to the new emperor's cronies pointed at and mocked, a living freak show exhibit that served to highlight the moral superiority of the new regime. He was a living trophy not of his owner's personal fantasy, but of his owner's victory over a despised past. But for a populist showman like Vitellius, the private spectacle was not enough. The ultimate degradation had to be a public one. The final change of masters had brought with it the final, and most horrific, redefinition of his purpose. He was a living joke, and Vitellius, in his profound and unimaginative cruelty, intended to share the punchline with the Roman people. The reign of Vitellius was a theatre of cruelty, but its stage was not the refined and psychologically complex world of the Neronian court. It was the coarse, blood-soaks, and of the gladiatorial arena. Vitellius, ever the populist, understood that the quickest way to the affections of the Roman mob was through bread and circuses. He sponsored lavish and brutal games, filling the amphitheaters with exotic beasts and novel forms of execution. Sporus was no longer an imperial curiosity to be privately mocked. He was a potential public spectacle, a famous name whose final degradation could serve as the headline act in the new emperor's bloody festival. The imperial decree was issued. It was a sentence of death, but one of a particularly imaginative and horrific kind. Sporus was condemned to the arena. He was not to be a gladiator, nor was he to be simply thrown to the beasts. His sentence was to be the centerpiece of a fatal charade, a form of public execution popular at the time where condemned criminals were forced to reenact scenes from mythology, with the mythological characters' gruesome death made brutally real. These spectacles blurred the line between theater and execution, transforming state-sanctioned killing into a narrative art form for the entertainment of the masses. The criminal was not just killed. Their death was made into a story. The specific myth chosen for Sporus was one of unbearable, calculated cruelty. According to the accounts of Cassius Dio and Suetonius, he was to be the lead actor in a reenactment of the rape of Proserpina. In the Roman myth, Proserpina, the Greek Persephone, the beautiful daughter of the goddess Ceres, is gathering flowers when Pluto, the god of the underworld, erupts from the earth in his chariot, abducts her, and drags her down into his dark realm to be his queen, of a violent and non-consensual journey into darkness. The choice of this particular myth was a masterstroke of psychological torture. For years, Sporus had been forced to live as a woman, his identity defined by a forced marriage and a feminine persona. Now, in his final moments, he was being condemned to publicly perform a myth centered on the violent sexual subjugation of a female figure. It was the ultimate, brutal mockery of the life he had been forced to lead, and turning it into the engine of his public destruction. The performance was designed to humiliate him in the most profound way possible, attacking the very core of his stolen identity before it extinguished his life. The staging of such an event would have been elaborate. The arena floor would be transformed with scenery to suggest to be a colic meadow. Sporus, playing the role of Proserpina, would have been dressed in the costume of a young maiden. He would be forced to act out the part of the innocent girl gathering flowers. Then, at the appointed moment, a trapdoor in the arena floor would open. A man, likely another condemned criminal or a powerful slave chosen for his intimidating physique, playing the role of Pluto, would emerge, perhaps in a chariot drawn by black horses. The ensuing abduction would be real. Sporus would be violently seized, his struggles part of the performance, his screams of genuine terror interpreted by the crowd as part of the theatrical illusion. His death was scripted to be the climax of the scene. It is not specified whether he was to be killed during the staged abduction itself or ritually murdered afterward as the bride of the underworld. The ambiguity was part of the spectacle. The crowd would watch with breathless anticipation, thrilled by the convergence of myth, violence, and the degradation of a famous, almost mythical, figure from a fallen dynasty. For Sporus, the issuance of this decree was the final absolute confirmation of his status in the world. He had been an emperor's doll, a political pawn, a living ghost. Now, his final role was to be a human sacrifice on the altar of public entertainment. His body, which had been so meticulously altered, preserved, and adorned to fulfill the private fantasy of one man, was now to be publicly torn apart to satisfy the bloodlust of thousands. The sentence was passed. The script for his final, agonizing performance had been written. There was no court of appeal, no hope of pardon. He was trapped in the final act of a tragedy that had been his entire life, and the only exit was through a staged door that opened onto oblivion. In the days leading up to the games, Sporus was no longer an inhabitant of the imperial palace. He was a condemned criminal, likely held in the Amatine prison or a similar state-holding cell, a place of cold stone and despair. The gilded cage had been replaced by a granite one. The whispers of courtiers were replaced by the jeers of guards in the distant, ambient roar of the city, a sound that now carried the promise of his own imminent, unspectacular death. Here, stripped of all imperial trappings, he was finally and completely alone with the truth of his situation. He had been given the script for his public demise, a final, unwilling performance designed to be the ultimate consummation of his life's humiliation. Faced with this absolute and inescapable fate, Sporus made his first and final independent decision. He chose not to perform. Within the philosophical and social framework of Rome, suicide was not universally seen as an act of cowardice or despair. For the Roman elite, particularly those influenced by Stoicism, it was the ultimate expression of personal liberty, the freedom to choose the manner and moment of one's death in the face of tyranny, dishonor, or incurable suffering. It was a way to wrest control from a tyrant's hand, to assert that one's own will was the final arbiter of one's own existence. Sporus was not a Stoic philosopher. He was a boy of low birth, a freedman or a slave whose entire life had been a lesson in the complete absence of freedom. Yet, in his final days, he arrived at a deeply stoic conclusion. His choice was not a flight from pain, though the physical agony of his sentence would have been unimaginable. It was a flight from public degradation. The sentence passed by Vitellius was not merely for death. It was for a narrative of death. He was to be the protagonist in a story of violation, his real terror serving as entertainment, his real subjugation serving as a mythological tableau. To walk on to the arenas and would be to accept that role, to become a willing, if screaming, participant in the final chapter that his tormentors had written for him. It would be the ultimate act of submission, allowing his body and his death to be used as a public spectacle, a final, lurid joke for the amusement of the mob and the glorification of their new emperor. By choosing to take his own life, Sporus executed an act of profound and final resistance. It was a unilateral cancellation of the performance. He denied Vitellius his spectacle. He denied the crowd their entertainment. He denied his captors the final satisfaction of authoring his end. His entire life since his discovery by Nero's agents had been a process of being acted upon. His body was altered, his name was changed, his identity was fabricated, his person was transferred from one owner to another. He was an object, a text written and rewritten by the powerful men who possessed him. His suicide was the one act that could not be dictated. It was a reclamation of his own physical being. They could decree his death, but he, and he alone, could control the precise moment and the specific context of that death. The historical sources do not record the specific method, whether he found a way to obtain a blade, or used a cord, or resorted to the desperate expedient of dashing his head against the stone walls of his cell. The result was the same. His keepers arriving to escort him to the arena would have found not a terrified actor ready for his final scene, but a body. It was a corpse that had been rendered useless for their purposes. It could be disposed of, but it could no longer be performed with. The story of the rape of Proserpina, set to be the highlight of the day's games, was abruptly cancelled due to the non-cooperation of its star. This final act was the ultimate expression of agency available to a person who had been systematically denied all forms of it. It was a desperate and tragic choice, born of unbearable circumstances, but it was a choice nonetheless. He chose not life, but the terms of his own non-existence. After a life spent as a reflection of others' desires, the ghost of a dead woman, a political trophy, and a public joke, Sporus seized the final moment of authorship. His death was not a submission to despair, but the ultimate act of editorial control. He had become the final author of his own story by choosing to end it. And so the account concludes. The boy known as Sporus, who was forced to become an empress named Sabina, vanishes from the historical record in a small, dark cell, leaving behind only a brief, chilling report of his final act of defiance. His story is a singular and extreme case, a footnote in the larger, blood-soaked narrative of the year of the 4 emperors. Yet the forces that shaped his brief, tragic life, the unchecked power of a tyrant, the sycophancy of a terrified court, the brutal objectification of one human being for the psychological needs of another, and the cynical use of a person as a political symbol, are not confined to the 1st century. The names change, the dates are different, but the echoes of these events can still be heard today if you listen carefully enough. The patterns of power, obsession, and dehumanization he endured are woven into the fabric of history, repairing in different costumes on different stages. The story of Sporus is not merely about what one mad emperor did to one helpless boy. It is a sterile, clinical slide under the microscope, revealing a pathology that is not mere onium but humor. It exposes the terrifying fragility of identity itself, and how easily it can be unmade when one person holds absolute power over another. The tale is concluded, preserved as a warning that is seldom heeded. Farewell.